F, revising, is rewriting.
So what does revision mean and how do you do it? Well, we've already been doing it for a while in the tape. You see, the word revision means to see again in a new way. You have a new vision of what you've written.
I try to revise my paper by cutting it up line by line and pasting it back together. It didn't work very well.
Now, when we say revision, we mean that you're entirely rethinking your paper. You're not just sticking in some commas here and there and rearranging the words in a couple of sentences. You're taking a step back from your paper and re-examining your thesis, argument, introduction, etc., etc.
And one other tidbit about revision. It doesn't happen only at the end of the writing process. You're doing it the whole time. You rethink your ideas with every free write, every outline, and every rough draft you do. As you get research or as you get feedback from others, you're rethinking your paper. You're constantly going back and thinking, is that exactly what I mean to say? So let's go back to Nathan. He's taken a rest from his paper and then gone back and looked it over again and made some changes.
Nathan now has a second draft of his paper. You can read it for yourself on the insert card labeled paper number 2. You can follow the changes we will make to this draft by looking at the essay labeled paper number 3.
So here's the scoop on Nathan's second draft. He's elaborated on his descriptions of the different groups. He's added to his conclusion and introduction. He's also inserted some quotations and paraphrases from his outside readings into his paper where he thinks they fit.
Now, in revising his paper, Nathan hasn't changed his opinions on what he's written. Sometimes when you revise a piece of writing, you'll totally change the way you look at the content. Nathan has expanded on his opinions and made them more specific, but he hasn't changed his views on high school groups. Nathan's focused more on reorganizing and clarifying his writing.
Nathan decides to take the second draft of his paper to his professor to get some feedback. Remember, you get good feedback by asking specific questions of your reader. So Nathan's put together the following list of questions for his professor.
First question, does my thesis statement have an interesting position on the topic? Second, does my argument back up my thesis? Third, have I used my research well? And finally, are my introduction and conclusion engaging to my reader, and do they reflect the focus of my paper?
Remember, what questions you choose to ask your reader depend upon what stage of the writing process you're in, what concerns you have about the assignment, and who your reader is.
So let's take a look at the comments of Nathan's professor and talk about a few more aspects of writing in college.
His first comment is Nathan's title for the paper, High School Groups. His professor feels that it should engage the reader more. The way it is now, it says what the subject of the paper is, but doesn't catch the reader's attention.
When you're trying to decide on a title, you want a title that reflects what you've written and makes someone want to read more of your paper. Now, obviously, if you're doing a lab report on freezing points, you don't need to come up with some catchy title like Brr, Temperature, and You. But from your title, your reader should know what to expect from your paper and be interested by it.
Nathan decides to change his paper to Lions and Tigers and Nerds, oh my! This title plays off the reference to The Wizard of Oz and the subject of the paper.
Coming up next, the second comment.
The professor's next comment is Nathan's reference to a John Hughes film. He thinks the reference is too obscure and might distract the reader if he or she didn't know who John Hughes is.
When Sam read his paper, she didn't comment on Nathan's John Hughes reference because she knew it. Nathan's professor is from a different generation and doesn't know the reference. The professor is Nathan's audience, so Nathan decides to take the sentence out. His professor's next comment is about Nathan's next two sentences. When you try to label people, stereotypes and generalizations abound. But here, for the sake of humor and social justice, I will blatantly label and mock based on my experiences in public high school.
Remember earlier we said that one of the characteristics of good academic prose is an awareness of other points of view? That's what Nathan is doing here.
Nathan's acknowledging that these are just his opinions based on his personal experiences.
Let's go back to the comment Nathan's professor made. Nathan said these are only his opinions based on his personal experiences, but his professor thinks Nathan should also identify other biases he might bring to his observations based on his economic class, race, and gender. So Nathan adds a couple sentences.
He writes, the phenomenon of social groups among adolescents occurs across racial, gender, and economic divisions in rural and urban areas and in both public and private high schools. This paper will concentrate on my own experiences, that of a white, middle-class male at a public high school.
Nathan's managed to do a couple things with these added sentences.
First, he's identified who he is and that the groups he's breaking high school into are only based on his own experiences. But this sentence also states that social groups form everywhere. Lots of other people have had the same experiences as Nathan. Even though Nathan's argument is based on his own observations, he can still argue that his paper reflects high school groups in other places as well.
A third comment the professor makes is about Nathan's thesis statement. His current thesis is, students in public high school can be broken down into 3 general groups, the coolies, the nerds, and the fledgling middle class. These groups, once defined, can then be broken down into a number of subgroups. His professor believes it's too vague and needs to state a more focused and stronger position. So Nathan needs to state a stronger thesis. There's lots of ways to make your thesis better.
For example, you can talk to your professor or another student about your paper. Or you can go back and reread your research and your paper. Any of these ways can help you find holes in your argument or can help stimulate new ideas for your topic by putting a charge in your thinking. Nathan's decided to add to his previous thesis statement by rereading his research.
The stuff I've collected shows that the different characteristics of each group create boundaries between high school students. It's like there's a line or a boundary between the groups, like the jocks are over here and the nerds are over here, and it's very difficult for them to cross over.
Based on this research, Nathan writes the following thesis statement. Students in public high school can be broken down into 3 general groups, the coolies, the nerds, and the fledgling middle class. These groups, once defined, can then be broken down into a number of subgroups, each with distinct characteristics which function as boundaries and barriers among students within the high school culture.
This thesis statement is better because it adds depth to Nathan's previous thesis statement and makes it more specific.
By adding that these groups function as boundaries and barriers among students within the high school culture, Nathan shows how important groups are in high school. He makes his argument stronger by showing how these groups function.
Whenever you revise your thesis statement, you want to be sure the rest of your paper reflects that change. Why? Because all the supporting paragraphs in your paper should back up your thesis.
Also, even though you may see how your supporting paragraphs back up your thesis, your reader might not. That's why we stick in transition sentences.
What do we mean by that?
Well, it's a good idea when revising your thesis to rewrite your transition sentences to make sure they refer back to your new thesis. So let's go back to Nathan's paper and look at how he writes in a transition sentence that connects back to his new thesis. For example, look at the end of Nathan's paragraph on jocks in paper number 2.
Right now, the paragraph ends, "The jocks are the people who go to college and party until 3 in the morning before an exam. They think this is the coolest thing ever." Now, if we compare this sentence with his new thesis, we see that the sentence at the end of the jock paragraph says nothing about how groups that form in high school function as boundaries and barriers among students in high school.
So let's hear how Nathan's going to connect his paragraph on jocks back to his thesis.
Well, I noticed that there are 2 major boundaries between jocks and the other kids. One is physical, because to be a jock, you have to be athletically inclined. The second major boundary is behavioral, like the way jocks travel in packs to away games and strut down the halls.
Based on these observations Nathan's made and his new thesis statement, he adds the following sentence at the end of the paragraph on jocks. Remember, all changes we make will be on the insert card labeled paper number 3.
Boundaries created between the jocks and other groups are both physical, dependent on whether one is athletically inclined, and behavioral, dependent on strutting proudly through the halls and traveling in packs to away games. This sentence further defines this high school group and refers back to the thesis. Notice this new sentence uses boundaries in it. This word is also used in Nathan's thesis statement. Using the key word will remind his reader of how this paragraph refers back to his thesis statement.
It's good to pick out a few key words from your thesis statement and continually use them, especially in your transition sentences and your conclusion. In fact, you should set your thesis statement next to your paper towards the end of the writing process and go through and make sure every transition sentence in some way refers back to your thesis. That way, your organization will be clearer to your reader. Nathan would need to go back and do this for his paper.
Earlier, we said some preliminary outlining can help you organize your ideas. Well, outlining after your paper's done can also help make sure your paper's organized well.
You can create a linear outline as we did before. For example, Nathan would have his thesis at the top, followed by the first major group, the popular kids. Then he would divide the different popular kids and make sure he referred back to his thesis at the end of each group.
Another type of outline you can use is a wheel.
The center of the wheel is your thesis. You shoot spokes out of this middle. The ends of the spokes represent the different parts of your supporting paragraphs. For Nathan, each spoke would be a different social group. Then you write your transition sentence along each spoke that shows how this supporting point refers back to your thesis.
Now, you don't have to do a wheel outline, but creating outlines of your paper at the end of the writing process is a good way to make sure your paper's organized. It's just another helpful writing strategy.
Let's go back to Nathan's professor and see what else he has to say.
Another comment the professor has is that two of Nathan's sentences don't seem to be his words, and he questions if Nathan cited them wrong.
So let's talk about citing sources in your paper for a minute or so. As we said before, there are two ways you can cite someone else's words in your paper: the paraphrase and the direct quotation.
All right, let's say you've got this great quote or paraphrase for your paper. What do you do with it? Well, there's two really important things you need to do to make sure you don't plagiarize.
First, always cite any ideas you borrow from others.
Whether you're quoting someone else's words or putting his or her ideas into your own words, you must credit the author. This isn't a bad thing. Citing someone else's opinion makes your ideas sound more legitimate and makes you a hit at cocktail parties.
The second thing you want to make sure you do is cite your source correctly.
And just how do you cite a source? Well, how you cite a source depends upon what discipline you're writing in, your professor, and the assignment.
But you should always check the assignment and check with your professor to see what kind of documentation style he or she prefers. If you ever get confused about what way you're supposed to cite something, then check a style manual. We won't go into documenting sources in this tape.
Regardless of which format you use, you will have to acknowledge the source and page number of the quote or idea you borrowed. You'll also have to include all the information for the source, like the author, title, and publishing info, and for extra credit, the author's favorite color and choice of detergent. All of these things go in a list of the sources you used at the end of the paper.
So now you know how to cite this great quote or paraphrase you have. But there's more to it than that. You want to be sure to use your source the right way in your paper. So what's the right way? If you're paraphrasing, you want to be sure to paraphrase accurately and effectively. Effective paraphrase is one that maintains the main idea of the author, but simplifies the way it is said and gets rid of any unnecessary jargon.
Let's go back to Nathan's paper. Remember his professor's concern that Nathan hasn't cited his source correctly because it doesn't sound like Nathan's words. Nathan cited his sentence, but he didn't put quotes around it. Since there are not quotes, we can assume Nathan's paraphrasing. So all the words in his paraphrase sentence must be his own words. The cited sentence reads, "The forces that operate to bring individuals together in groups are effective in part because others are kept out. The boundaries that identify friendships in groups imply barriers for entry and penalties for exit."
Now let's return to the page from which Nathan got this passage.
The passage reads, "The forces that operate to bring individuals together in intimate relations are effective in part because others are kept out." Notice he only changed intimate relations to groups, so almost this entire passage is still a quote. Nathan's sentence would be considered plagiarism.
So, how'd you feel when you found out you plagiarized?
I
I was flabbergasted. Plagiarism. I mean, I thought, that's only for the bad kids, you know? I guess I just thought it could never happen to me.
So Nathan's plagiarized his source. Remember, a paraphrase keeps only the main idea of the author and none of the author's language. A paraphrase should both condense the author's ideas and change the words. Let's look at the quoted sentences and Nathan's new paraphrase of them.
Remember, the quote was, "The forces that operate to bring individuals together in intimate relations are effective in part because others are kept out. The boundaries that identify friendships and groups imply barriers for entry and penalties for exit." Now let's look at Nathan's paraphrase. The formation of groups among high school students serves both to draw distinctions between who is in and who is out. Each subgroup is defined by distinct characteristics, thus creating barriers among members and non-members. This new paraphrase holds on to the main idea of the author. It still says that groups form in high school and that they work because they bring some people together and set up barriers to others. These groups help establish clear identities for the members of the groups. So the main idea is still there, but the author's words aren't being used.
And remember, even if you put an idea into your own words, you still gotta cite it. So, that's the skinny on paraphrasing.
Now let's look at the professor's comment about a quote Nathan uses in his last paragraph. His teacher thinks Nathan hasn't explained how the quote connects to the sentence right before it and right after it. So let's talk about using a quotation in a paper.
When you're using a quote, you want to be sure to integrate it smoothly into the flow of your paper. This is called bracketing the quote. Your reader should see the quote coming. That's the first bracket. The reader shouldn't get lost and fall in some Grand Canyon between your words and the quoted ones. Then the quote comes. After the quote, your reader should understand why you're using this quote. That's the second bracket. The sentence following the quote should explain the quote and make the connection between the quote and your paper.
So let's go back to paper number 2 and see how Nathan's used his quote. The revision of the quote will be in paper number 3.
Yet whether or not my classifications are skewed, peer group formation as a phenomenon does exist. The most important determinant of a trend, however, is neither merchandisers nor the media. It's the vast, ineffable plasma of intra-teen peer pressure. It's hard for these observations to be anything but subjective.
The problem with the quote is that the reader doesn't know why it's being used. Just like tributaries flowing into a river, quotes should flow smoothly into the rest of the paper. That's why you should bracket a quote. Looking at Nathan's paper, we see that the quote does relate to the sentence before it. The sentence before it suggests that peer group formation exists. The quote reaffirms this because it shows that trends are guided by peer pressure, not the media or merchandisers. The problem is that it's not obvious to the reader that the quote is coming, nor why it's being used.
So Nathan goes back and inserts a lead sentence into the quotation. Remember, like Ed McMahon for Johnny Carson, so a lead sentence introduces the quote. It provides a transition between the writer's words and the quotation.
The two sentences before the quote now read, "Yet whether or not my classifications are skewed, peer group formation as a phenomenon does exist. Never underestimate the power of peers and the pressure they can apply. For example, a recent article chronicles the development of the torn jeans fad, noting, the most important determinant of a trend, however, is neither merchandisers nor the media. It's the vast, ineffable plasma of intra-teen peer pressure."
The important change Nathan's made is to smoothly connect his words to the quote.
The quote is introduced by a summary of the article from which the quote came. The lead into the quote also begins with "for example." So the lead into the quote tells the reader he or she is about to get an example of the power of peers and peer pressure and where the quote is from. There's a smooth transition between Nathan's words and the quote.
Now let's look at the sentence that follows the quote.
The sentence that follows the quote is, "It's hard for these observations to be anything but subjective." This line does refer back to the beginning of the paragraph where he wrote, "The classifications of these groups is rooted in personal experience and is most likely biased and inaccurate to many." But it doesn't logically follow from the quote, which is about peer pressure. The sentence that follows it is about the subjective nature of his classifications of the different groups. There needs to be a sentence following the quote that segues between the quote and the following thought.
So Nathan decides he will again mention peer pressure, the subject of the quote, after the quotation. That way he's formed a transition between the quote and the rest of his paper. So he follows the quote with several sentences that return to the focus of his paper.
Notice that the first sentence after the quotation continues the quote's thought about peer pressure. Nathan follows this sentence with a return to the subjective nature of his classifications, which the paragraph opened with. Then it returns to the focus of his paper, social groups. So it backs up his thesis and connects his choice of the quote to his paper. It connects peer pressure to the creation of social groups.
All right, so that covers integrating a quote and how to properly paraphrase a passage. You integrate a quote by creating a smooth flow between your words and the quoted ones, as well as showing how the quote connects to the subject of the paper. A good paraphrase retains the author's ideas, but none of his or her words.
The next thing we're going to discuss is writing a good conclusion. Like we said earlier, what you write about in your conclusion depends upon the class for which the paper is written and the assignment. But there are a few things you can do with your conclusion to make it better.
For most academic papers, you want your conclusion to return to your introduction and thesis. The best way to do this is to go back to your introduction and thesis and look for specific statements or ideas which you said there. Then, in your conclusion, try to say them again without repeating them exactly. Your introduction and conclusion should be like bookends of your paper. It's important for your reader to believe that you've said all that needed to be said about the topic of your paper in between the introduction and conclusion.
A good strategy for tying together the introduction and conclusion is to set your introduction and thesis statement next to your conclusion and try to place key words, ideas, or images from the beginning of your paper into your conclusion. An additional thing you can do in your conclusion is leave your reader with a powerful image or emotion that relates to your topic. By leaving your readers with this image or emotion, they're forced to think about your topic after the paper's finished.
Let's look at Nathan's conclusion. His conclusion does 3 specific things in order to tie it to his introduction. He also ends his conclusion with a personal anecdote.
Now let's discuss the 3 points Nathan makes, which link together his introduction and conclusion.
First link.
First, Nathan reaffirms that his observations are based on his personal experience. The sentence in the introduction reads, "I will blatantly classify particular peer groups based on my experiences in public high school." The opening sentence in his conclusion is, "The classification of these groups is rooted in my personal experience and is most likely biased and inaccurate to many." He's reminding the reader that all the groups he describes are based on his own experiences in high school.
The second link.
In his introduction, Nathan argues that peer group formation occurs across racial, gender, and economic divisions, blah, blah, blah. Nathan made the point that kids in high school divide into groups everywhere. This wasn't some kind of spooky phenomenon that happened only at his school.
So Nathan's going to say this again in his conclusion. Whether or not my classifications are skewed, peer group formation does exist. Then, Nathan backs up this argument in the conclusion by using the anecdote about the torn jeans fad as an example of the power of peer groups and the pressure they apply.
So Nathan's reasserting that other people have made the same observation as him. His opinions are supported by others.
The third link.
A third thing that Nathan does in his conclusion to refer back to his introduction is to use key words from his introduction. Let's look at the sentences from his introduction.
The sentence in his introduction is, "The formation of groups among high school students serves both to draw distinctions between who is in and who is out." Now look at the sentences in his conclusion. "Regardless of my subjective experiences, one thing is true. Across the country, in high school after high school, these pressures are creating social groups, defining who is in and who is out." So Nathan has gone back to the key words in and out. This serves as a reminder to his reader of his introductory remarks and the argument he's making, that social groups in high school exist and are very powerful. This sentence refers back to a line in his introduction.
Let's look at one more element that makes Nathan's conclusion effective. Remember, we said a good conclusion leaves your reader with a strong image or emotion. Nathan's using a personal anecdote to do this.
Nathan, why don't you tell us about your personal anecdote?
Well, I was leaving the library with a few books under my arm when one of my old high school friends met me on the quad.
Hey, are you rushing too? Oh, don't tell me you're becoming a nerd.
I just wanted to do well my first semester.
Yeah, that's what I said. A nerd. Think quick.
You know, that guy and me had some good times in high school. I remember one time we both checked out library books on the same day, and we had this little competition going to see who could keep his book out the longest. We got in some trouble for that. I guess we just went in different directions.
So Nathan's going to end his paper with this personal anecdote. Let's look at his conclusion.
First, Nathan introduces his quote. Take me, for instance. In high school, I was a confirmed member of the fledgling middle class, but now that I'm in college, the pressures are such that I'm doing things I wouldn't have done there. Then Nathan tells the personal anecdote. This new ending works well because it leaves the reader with a lasting image, Nathan's high school friend calling him a nerd. This ending also shows what high school group Nathan was in. This ending leaves the reader with a fresh perspective on the subject.
It's a masterpiece.
Right on, man.
So overall, Nathan's conclusion is good. It's good because it refers back to his introduction, thesis, and argument, but it does so without merely repeating what was said in the beginning of his paper. The quote from the article offers a slightly new spin on the topic that interests the reader and broadens the scope of Nathan's argument, while at the same time reaffirming it. The final personal anecdote leaves the reader with a strong image in his or her mind.
All right, so you feel like your paper's almost done. You're happy with your thesis statement, your organization, and everything else.
So, what's left?
Well, now you need to look at the small stuff, like any grammar problems you might have, or typos. Like it or not, your teachers and employers are going to judge your writing by the little mistakes you make. But grammar's a whole other can of worms. So we'll save that for another tape. We will talk about one more thing, and that is that you should spell check your paper on a computer.
Remember, even a monkey can use a spell checker, so you can imagine that your employers will be mad if you don't use it.
And just remember that there are words you can misspell, and the spell check will miss them, like there, and there.